Hello, this is 100 Green YouTube channel, channel of green transformation of Ukraine. I'm Dmitry Vasilov, and today we have a topic low carbon Ukraine with a very special guest from Germany, Robert Kірхнер, authorized representative of Berlin Economics, and team leader of exactly the same name project of support from the German government to Ukrainian government, the project called Low Carbon Ukraine. Hello, Robert.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you for being with us today. Germany, in fact, is a leader in implementing a great strategies on decarbonization, one of the EU leaders and world leaders. And of course, it's kind of reasonable that in 2018, this project began in Ukraine, called Low Carbon Ukraine. At that time, not too many people actually, even in the government, were keen on the issue. But the project began, and I think it was one of the first leading projects to which started good policies in the Ukrainian government, which then led the Ukrainian government to sign up with the European Green Deal commitments. So could you tell a little bit about the project, why it began in 2018, and what was the actual idea? Why at that time you already were talking about low carbon Ukraine?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a very good question, and I think there are different parts of an answer to it. And one thing is the first thing that you rightly mentioned. Germany is very ambitious in its climate policies, and I think I would say this is a consensus across society. It doesn't necessarily depend who is in power. Obviously, there are differences, nuances, but overall, I think for many years now in Germany, it is a consensus that we are moving on towards this path. The second thing is, I think, the recognition that fighting climate change is a global problem. I mean, as a country itself, you cannot really influence events on the global scale. Yeah, even if you would be like net zero and everyone around you would be still working like they used to, it would not have any impact on the global scale. So that's why the international dimension is very important, and I think German policy makers recognized it very early and engaged very much in international climate diplomacy. Yeah, so we are really trying to help other countries to follow our path, to support them with different tools and instruments to kind of follow a similar approach. And then the third element is Ukraine, which obviously is a big country, an industrialized country, has a very inefficient use of energy with a lot of emissions. It is also part of the post-Soviet heritage, obviously. But at the same time, the country has moved over the last years, and maybe 2014 is here a very remarkable year, with this European orientation, with the association agreement, moved towards the European Union. And all three things together actually explain why we have been active for some years now in this process of helping Ukraine, supporting Ukraine in its path towards decarbonization.
Wonderful. And of course, before the war, the issue of the special tax on carbon tax called CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, was very actively discussed here in Ukraine. And I think you were one of the parts with your project to support Ukrainian government with correct policies, because that was exactly the issue what you were telling about, for example, Germany could be a leader in the decarbonization process, but the country which is very close, like Ukraine, could still leak a lot of carbon to our atmosphere. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, it could not work for the real climate change efforts. Mm-hmm. That's why, as far as it was declared by the European Green Deal, mm-hmm. Process where Ukraine was signing up mm-hmm. its documents with the European Union, mm-hmm. Ukraine had decided that actually we commit to be on the same path. Yeah. And our business, Ukrainian business, was also very active actively developing their policies, business policies, to make sure that actually they could be a good part of this carbon border adjustment mechanism process, to make sure that actually they could be a great exporters with the less taxation because of carbon.
Exactly.
And perhaps, you could describe a little bit of more details of those policies which you suggested to the Ukrainian government, perhaps to some other players, like business players in Ukraine, when that process began before the war.
I mean, so basically the project, as you rightly mentioned, started long before the war, so it was not due to the war established. I mean, the project got renewed recently in the war, which is a very good sign, which is also a sign of support, and also shows the importance that Germany attaches to this topic. You mentioned the business sector, CBAMP, trade, so maybe taking this from a bit different angle, Ukraine is a very export-oriented economy, very open economy, steel, agriculture goods, and so on. So this is something that we know, and at the same time we've seen that Ukraine and its business has been reorienting its trade flows more and more towards Europe. And the association agreement that I mentioned, which is still in force, and now the accession process, which will start. So we have now actually reached a new status last year, with being accepted as a candidate country. All this has gradually over the years clearly influenced Ukraine trade towards Europe and made the European market more important for Ukraine exporters. The war that started now and has unfortunately also blocked different export routes to other countries. We know about the problems in the Black Sea, where basically there are no exports or imports possible anymore, unfortunately, also since Russia sabotaged the grain deal, have further accelerated this process. Now, I mean, Ukraine really predominantly trades with the European Union, which means that the routes that you need to play by on the European market are the routes that Ukrainian business need to comply. And one of them, it's not the only one, obviously, but one of them is in terms of emissions and being on the same page there. And I think business has very early recognized that and are now actually also a kind of driver of this process, because they know that if the Ukrainian legislation is not aligned with the European legislation and in this sphere, it means they have a competitive disadvantage to other players on the market, and they were pushing that. And indeed, topics like carbon pricing have been featured very early in our work. We have also worked on strategic documents, the NECP, the NDC, all these documents that are required by a different international institution that Union develops them and complies with them. We have been supporting mainly with capacity, modeling capacity. So this was something where our project was, I think, filling a gap that Ukraine had at that time, and to some extent still has. But obviously, the domestic capacity is also evolving.
During the war, last heating season, we had incredibly horrible situation with the damages of our infrastructure, and particularly energy infrastructure. What we understood, what we have to do, we have to decentralize our energy system. And decentralization, in many ways, it means also more focus on renewable energy, and this is totally in line with low carbon policies. Even there, already during the war, our parliament adopted the new legislation, the law number 1911-D, which is actually looking to the more stimulation to the renewable energy development. In these terms, as we talking about the project Low Carbon Ukraine, German support to Ukraine, you've seen the process before the war, and you just mentioned that actually the project renewed during the war, just very recently, about half a year ago. And you could see actually differences, what was before the war and what is Ukrainian policies during the war. So what is your look when you look more careful as a think tank and analytical person?
That is a very good question. Obviously, the war is a huge humanitarian, economic, financial disaster for everyone, right? I mean, this is for sure. And obviously, it presents huge challenges. It's like a huge exogenous shock, and it has really I mean, the economy went down by 30% almost last year, right? And now it starts to bottoming out and to grow again. But obviously, till we have reached the levels from before the war, that will take many years, right? And then we have the issue of reconstruction and recovery, the funding volumes that are needed and all that. So this is a separate discussion, but because you mentioned on low carbon policies, it is very good that policymakers, parliament, but also in the government continue this process. And I think there's a law that you mentioned that has been adopted and is in place now is a very good example. And we worked also on that. But then there was also a second, I would say, stream of activity that people or hospitals, schools, they realized due to the mentioned attacks on critical infrastructure and energy infrastructure, which led to, for instance, blackouts, and this can be sometimes be a matter of life or death, right? If you're in a hospital, you have a surgery and suddenly the lights go out, then it can be really have the gravest consequences. And that is something that I would say over the whole country led to, a kind of boom in decentralized renewable deployment. Solar, I think is here to mention, generators also, backup facilities and so on, batteries, which probably the intention was not to lower emissions or to lower the carbon footprint. The motivation was obviously to be more resilient, to avoid grid collapse by having own, but it contributed, or it contributes this process also to lowering the carbon footprint, because I mean now you're using renewable sources of energy increases. So in that sense, even though the motivation of this, what we are seeing in a very widespread move across the country, was not that people wanted to lower the carbon footprint, but the result will be similar. But at the same time, this needs to be accompanied by policymaking. And then again, you mentioned the law that has been adopted by the Rada. So we see this as well, which is a good sign that even there is a war, and obviously it is for everyone understandable that the priority for Ukraine is to win this war and to fight this unjust aggression, that still Parliament can and does make progress on this agenda, which again has with this energy security aspect that now enters into play. Yeah, you mentioned the attacks last year. We might have renewed attacks this winter. I think this is a discussion that everyone currently has. That this helps to address this energy security concerns, but at the same time, again, will also contribute to a lower carbon footprint.
Sure. Robert, I would like actually to bring you to a more kind of people's-like question from the professional discussions. Germany is a great help to Ukraine, as many European partners. And personally, when I was in Germany this spring for energy event, which you were also helping to carry out, I saw so many Ukrainian flags everywhere in Berlin, so much of support from people and from the government. And this is really, as to Ukrainian, this is a feeling of a great help, which we receive from European partners, and particularly from Germany. And the fact that you are German right now in Ukraine, and this is quite dangerous situation, because they continue to send rockets, they continue to fight, they continue the war against us, but you are supporting, and your presence here is a great support itself. But what is your personal impressions? You're here in Ukraine, and of course you look at everything as a professional, as a think tank, as a director of this organization and policy makings. But what is your impression of being here as a person in the country during the war? How do you feel about it?
Very good question, and I can only give you a very some feelings that cross my mind, because I'm still also trying to understand for myself how is it being here right now, because my history is that I've been to Kiev very regularly since 2006 or 7, so I have a history in the city for like 15 years going back, with regular trips by airplane in peacetime. The first difference that I had now, it's the first time that I'm here in the war. My last trip was just 2 or 3 weeks before the war. The first difference was getting here. Yeah, 28 hours on different trains through Poland and arriving here on the passenger station, which is the first time for me. Yeah. Second is then downloading the air raid alarm, knowing where the shelter is, going to the shelter yesterday. That is one thing which is still for me new and of course makes this war more
Tangible.
On the other hand, knowing that actually the real war is on the front lines where people die as we speak. At the same time, I'm impressed by this work here that the government, our partners, you do. So even there is a war and people have beloved ones which are fighting the war, they're constantly also in fear and so on, they still carry on and they still govern the country. So even so, and as you mentioned also the draft law, even so there are other topics very high on the priority to, organize the military support and all this. Financial support is very important. Still, you also have time to do laws in other areas to drive reforms forward. And this is a very impressive thing. So, I'm very impressed by Ukraine's. I mean, I think we all are impressed by Ukraine's will of resistance. And you mentioned the flags and the support and so on. But still being here, feeling that in a way, in a more direct way, brings it on another level.
Exactly. We've been mentioning also European Union and our status of being a candidate for accession and association agreement, etc. And of course, these are a lot about legislation. These are a lot about policies, including energy policies and economy policies. And I want, with this issue, I want to come back to European Green Deal matter, because that's what we are talking about: decarbonization, low carbon Ukraine. In many ways, it is something which can help, as I think, for the future of government and for the future of economy. It can help in terms of energy and economic development of our country, and more fast accession to the European Union, with the frame of European Green Deal as well. What is your view of these processes right now here in Ukraine? Where do you think Ukraine stands now to fulfill all the necessary homework as a candidate to the membership, and also on the line of European Green Deal as well? And how do you see Ukraine in this process of being fast or not fast? And where do you see Ukraine actually in the future, let's say next 10, even 20 years? How do you see
this? This is a very tricky question for me. And I mean, I'm not like an expert on EU accession. And I think it seems to be realistic that towards the end of this year, maybe there is a date for opening negotiations, I think. But again, this depends on others to evaluate. But already that Ukraine got the candidate status is, I think, it's a huge win.
Yep.
How long this process will last, it's for me very hard to forecast. It depends obviously on the domestic reform momentum. It depends also on the willingness of the other EU countries to accept that. And there are also some other candidate countries, right? We should not forget about them. I mean, Ukraine, of course, has its domestic perspective, but there are also countries in the Balkans which are like in the queue, and we also, as EU, have to think about them. So it's a more there was Moldova also. It's a broader process. My hope is that it is as fast as possible, but not risking the quality of this, so that really legislation is really in line and implementation is in line with what EU membership requires. I think one topic we haven't touched upon, but where I see also low carbon Ukraine, low carbon policy, green policy that's very important, is the recovery and reconstruction process. Yes. I mean, this is also something in order to be competitive on the global landscape, not just on the EU market, but also on a wider context. It will be very important also to rebuild the steel sector, some other industrial sectors. You mentioned fertilizers also before, according to green principles. And I think Ukraine has very good chances to do so. And we, with our small input, of advice into the discussion are very much ready to influence that. But there are obviously also other institutions that help Ukraine with technical advice, but also with financial advice. This upcoming Ukraine EU facility is here also an example. Help them to decarbonize, to rebuild the economy in a competitive and greener way.
Yeah, I think it is also in many ways in line of kind of a time, how to say, I'll go from the other way and explain what I mean. Of course, we have a lot of destruction of our energy infrastructure during the last season. And some intelligence services are telling that actually it's going to be the same this winter time. So we're expecting very hard times and a lot of destructions. It's already done and perhaps will be in the future. But in many ways, you know, it also gives an opportunity to look at our energy system, as we've been telling also before, as to a new, totally modernized system, more decentralized, more renewable energy oriented. Now, where do you see, as a think tank, could be a better solution for Ukraine, for Ukrainian energy system, for Ukrainian government to focus on? What kind of renewable kind of mix could be the best for Ukraine, for the future perspectives, also in line with some kind of German policies, because you also look into this with perspective of a German background.
Yeah, I mean, one has to say, and also maybe to be realistic, the upcoming fears that the energy system might be again destroyed, and then this destruction would actually lead or would hit a system which is already weaker than it was last year, right? Because last year we came with overcapacities and so on, and this time we have already a system which survived but is in a weaker state, right? I think the short-term focus will be probably on repair. And I think this is realistic because as long as the war rages on, and we don't unfortunately have any signs that this will stop anytime soon, the focus will be on repair, emergency measures. I don't think that, you know, huge capex heavy projects can be implemented in the short term. Yeah, that is one thing. So we should be realistic on this. In a more medium to long term perspective, definitely the deployment of renewables, and Ukraine has huge potential in its regions. Obviously, some of it is in regions which are currently occupied. So deoccupation is important here. Is something that is important. For this, probably we will also need then political risk insurance or some sort of insurance that these investments, assets are safe from renewed attacks. Because I mean, Ukraine rightly points out the war didn't start in 22; it started in 14.
Exactly.
And so we have already this experience. And even if we would have some sort of peace agreement, one should prepare for possible other aggression and make this as safe as possible. That is one thing. The other thing is funding will be an issue due to the war, but also before. The investment climate in Ukraine had also issues. There have been things done, but still it needs to improve further. Costs of funding were very high, and that's something that also needs to somehow resolved. And then also, I would say market reforms. I mean, still we have to say that tariffs are not yet in all categories according to the market level, the cost recovery level. This is something which needs to also be changed over time in order to have a business case, in order to have an investment case for deploying, for instance, renewables. Obviously, I see the social impact. The war, I mean, Ukraine was always relatively a very poor European country. This war has made it even poorer, unfortunately. That means there will be need for social support. Yeah, this is absolutely clear. But then one can have developed instruments. Ukraine had actually instruments or has instruments like the housing utility subsidy, which then should be rolled out to address this, while the tariffs will be liberalized and then give a good signal to investors that can be money made and investments into renewables. This is one story. The other story is energy efficiency. I think there is still a lot of improvement, a lot of potential there. that Ukraine is able to reduce its energy consumption in different areas, and both together, I think, that give a very good, promising future on the Ukrainian future energy system when the war's over.
Yeah, Robert, thank you very much for this perspective. I think that's exactly what Low Carbon Ukraine project, what you lead with Berlin Economics is doing here in Ukraine, helping Ukrainian government to create these smart policies, I would say smart policies. And thank you again for this help of German government, which you implement the financial help and political help to Ukrainian government via this project Low Carbon Ukraine. Thank you very much, and thank you on a personal basis that you're here with us in Ukraine and supporting us as people.
Thank you very much. It's very kind.
Thank
It's
you.
a pleasure to be here.